with the sharp smell of brass and burned powder. Men stood in sunglasses, sleeves rolled, boots planted, watching the newest arrival like she was an inconvenience. Someone whispered that she was just a checkmark hire. Another muttered that recoil would throw her 2 feet backward. Eyes rolled when her name was called. 18-year-old Corporal Elise Harper stepped forward without hesitation, the long gun almost matching her full height. Senior Chief Morgan Locke didn't bother looking at her. Lieutenant Bradley Rourke pointed to Lane 4 with a bored gesture. A SEAL near the back slapped a stack of bills and called out $200 that she would miss anything past 700 meters. Elise didn't blink, didn't argue, didn't even acknowledge the comment. She rested her cheek on the stock, steady, unshaken, as if noise wasn't meant for her. She wasn't there to prove anything, just to do her part. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to Military and Veteran Stories so you never miss these true stories of courage. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? She grew up in the mountains, the kind of place where roads curved like rivers and fog hovered low across the valleys at dawn. Elise Harper spent more time on ridgelines than sidewalks, more time spotting groundhogs through cheap glass scopes than hanging out with kids her age. Her father wasn't military, just a quiet man who hunted because winters were long, and you learned early that a bad shot meant an empty freezer. Elise learned ballistics the way other teenagers learned car engines. Wind meant something. Light meant something. The rise and drop of land changed everything. She could see distance, not in yards, but in angles and air. At Fort Benning, she didn't talk much. She passed her marks without celebration. The instructors noticed, though most of her peers didn't. When everyone else celebrated hitting 800 meters, Elise had already mapped wind in her head. That earned her an expert qualification badge early, clean grouping on steel plates that most shooters treated like myth beyond a few hundred yards. They pinned her to a unit slot that wasn't supposed to challenge her, Sniper Overwatch Support, attached to SEAL Team Raven, expected to log telemetry when asked and maybe hold a sector if things got busy. Nothing more. When she arrived, nothing about her looked intimidating. Small frame, hair braided tight, uniform too new, boots barely scuffed. The SEALs didn't hide their thoughts. One of them casually asked Locke what they were supposed to do with the attachment. Another said they should put her with extra battery cases or map sheets. She didn't react, which somehow made their amusement worse. The first time Locke briefed the team, he didn't look at her once. His instructions landed everywhere except her direction, as if she wasn't even issued eye contact. Rourke didn't bother hiding what he thought. He set her ruck near an equipment crate and said, without humor or tone, "Light baggage stays last." Elise just nodded and slid her notebook under the strap of her rifle bag. When others rested after zeroing rifles, she sat near the far end of the range beneath the shadow of a concrete barrier, logging atmospherics. Temperature shifts, micro rise from heated dirt, barely visible vapor against metal. Wind wasn't wind to her. Wind had directions inside directions. She recorded each clue as if someone depended on accuracy later. 3 short breaths to regulate her chest, a small break, then one long, steady exhale. It looked rehearsed, but it wasn't. That was how she steadied herself since childhood. She wrote dope values by hand because she didn't trust electronic tools in the cold. Battery failure could end a shot. Handwritten notes didn't die. Tex, the SEAL sniper who believed he owned the role, watched her once while walking by. She didn't know he was there. He saw her mark wind calculations by drawing simple mountain silhouettes and shading where air would lift off rock. It looked like art, not combat math. He walked away shrugging, assuming it was her way of taking notes. She kept a mountain patch sewn on the underside of her kit strap. Not visible unless straps were fully loosened. No insignia, just faded blue-gray stitching of a ridge outline. Nobody knew what it meant. Nobody asked. She didn't offer an explanation. When she moved, she carried herself like someone who had been cold many times before, someone who had waited on wind while others gave up. She didn't rush, didn't try to get attention, didn't defend herself when someone mocked her small frame or soft hands. She simply let the noise drift over her. Most people mistook that quiet for uncertainty. It wasn't uncertainty. It was reserve. Morning PT, she fell in toward the back. One operator joked about her run times. She didn't argue. She finished her distance without slowing. When others stopped joking, she didn't celebrate that either. She just stretched her legs, logged conditions again, then looked toward the far ridge behind the range. Her eyes kept lifting to distance as if close range was too noisy. Mess hall time, the table where she sat, remained half empty. People didn't sit with her, not malicious, just indifferent. She sat, ate, cleaned her cup, folded her napkin, left no mess. When someone bumped her shoulder intentionally to see if she would flinch, she only straightened her fork. No anger, no embarrassment, no attempt to prove anything. She learned that silence becomes loud when everyone else expects reaction. Late one night, she sat on a metal bench outside the motor pool. The world around her carried diesel smell. Bagram lights flickered against dust. She wrote something in that same book, slow strokes, not hurried. When a passing corporal asked what she was studying, she closed the book, smiled once, and answered, "Weather." He laughed, thinking she was joking. But she wasn't. Her confidence didn't come from being right. It came from knowing she could wait. Still, those early days were heavy. People underestimated her not because they saw failure, but because nothing about her demanded attention. A quiet person among loud men becomes invisible, and invisible often translates to unimportant. Elise understood that. She didn't protest it. But every range session, every morning brief, every wind shift she memorized, something small kept building. Locke gave instructions again, still not looking her way, still expecting nothing from her. Rourke set her equipment behind heavier crates so it wouldn't clutter the front row. Tex made one more comment about letting real shots handle long-distance calls. Elise wrote wind data and closed her notebook. And somewhere between that silence and their certainty, a line formed. What would you have done? Laugh with the group, or stand alone in silence? The sun over Camp Halstead felt closer than it had any right to be. Heat shimmered above the firing line in waves, turning the distant steel plates into trembling silver ghosts. Men squinted behind tinted lenses, sleeves rolled, uniforms darkened with sweat where body armor trapped the day against their backs. Tex Hawthorne moved with the quiet confidence of a man who had performed this ritual 100 times in front of an audience. He checked his optic, tapped the edge of his kestrel, and gave a small half-grin toward the cluster of SEALs watching from behind the red line. To them, this was entertainment as much as training. To Tex, it was also territory. "Wind's dirty," someone muttered, more excuse than observation. Another answered that Mirage was lying today, that the heat was playing tricks on glass. Everyone seemed to have an opinion before a single shot had been fired. Tex settled behind his rifle, stock snug, cheek weld perfect. His breathing slowed in a way that drew respect even from those who teased him. He let the world narrow to the lane, the reticle, the steel silhouette sitting at 1,000 meters, just above a strip of pale earth. The first shot cracked out, sharp and clean, rolling off the concrete barriers. Through scopes and binoculars, a dozen sets of eyes searched for impact. A puff of dust kicked up just beyond the target, slightly off to the right. Steele stayed silent. "Bad mirage," someone said immediately, as if the range itself were to blame. "Scopes off," another offered. "Should have re-zeroed." Tex adjusted a fraction, jaw tight. The chuckles behind him were friendly, but they cut all the same. A second shot, another crack, another puff of dust behind the plate, this time farther off, pulled down by a small downhill breeze nobody had bothered to read. The steel remained stubbornly quiet. "Mirage is trash," a voice called. "Kestrel's drunk." Tex pushed himself up on his elbows, looking at the Kestrel as if willing it to accept the blame. He did not curse. He did not throw anything. Professionals rarely did. But the slight flex of his jaw said enough. He walked back from the line, rifle in hand, and a few slaps landed on his shoulder in that half-joking way soldiers used when they knew a man needed to save face. Elise had been at the far edge of the crowd, half behind a concrete support pillar. No one noticed the way her eyes tracked that little puff of dust behind the target. She did not look at Tex, she watched the ground. She watched where the dirt rose and where it fell, how long it hung, how the wind carried it sideways after impact. The dust leaned right, then bent a little left as it settled. Not bad, Mirage. Not bad, Kestrel. High crosswind shifting near the target, and a slow, lazy drift in the valley between shooter and steel. She wrote nothing down, but the correction hovered fully formed in her mind. Half a lane away, Lieutenant Bradley Rourke was talking quietly with Senior Chief Morgan Locke. They reviewed a training schedule on a clipboard, not even glancing in her direction. Elise kept her hands folded near her notebook, thumb pressing into the edge of the paper. She could have spoken then. Could have mentioned what she saw. No one had asked. Rourke finally turned toward the line and called for the next shooter. A couple of operators stepped forward, then stepped back when he shook his head. His gaze drifted over the group and landed, reluctantly, on Elise. "Fine," he said. "Lane 4. Let the attachment burn a few rounds." The attachment. Not the sniper, not the corporal. A piece of gear to be tested and stowed. The joke drew soft laughter. No one shouted. No one was cruel. The disrespect here was quieter than that. It lived in low tones, in eye rolls, in the way bodies shifted aside when she walked past with the long rifle. Elise stood, hands steady, and moved to lane 4. The TAC rifle looked oversized in her arms, but it rested in her grip like something familiar. She laid out her mat without drama, then lowered herself to the ground, boots digging into the dust, elbows planted. Rourke hovered near the rear, arms crossed, as if he expected to call a ceasefire at the first sign of trouble. Tex watched from the side, towel over his shoulder, expression unreadable now. Elise closed one eye, then opened it again, choosing instead to keep both eyes slightly narrowed behind the optic. The world sharpened and softened at the same time. Mirage rippled up from the ground, but to her it did not look like distortion, it looked like information. She took 3 short breaths, then set them aside. Her last inhale was slow, measured, filling only the bottom of her lungs. She checked her natural point of aim, adjusted her left elbow a fraction, and pressed the stock tighter against her shoulder until the rifle felt not held, but anchored. 900 meters first. Steel chest plate, white paint flaking, ground around it scarred from years of impacts. She read the Mirage, saw the slight right-to-left wash near the target, lighter near the shooter's position. No need to trust the Kestrel alone. The air itself was talking. Her finger found the trigger, touch so light it almost did not exist. The world shrank to one breath and the thin, clean break of steel against skin. The shot cracked. Dust jumped behind the plate, right where it should, and then a half-second later, the range rang with that unmistakable, heavy, gong-like sound of bullet on steel. It cut right through the noise on the line. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Someone gave a low whistle. No laughter this time. She did not smile, did not look back. She cycled the bolt, ejected the casing, and moved her crosshairs to the next plate. 900 again, just to be sure it was not chance. Another breath. The same ritual, the same steady weight of her cheek on the stock. Another shot. Another clean ring. Rourke's posture changed. He stepped closer without realizing it, pen forgotten in his hand. Behind him, Locke's gaze finally shifted from the clipboard to the end of lane 4. "Send her to 1,000, a voice said quietly. "No bet now." No jokes about recoil. Rourke hesitated, then nodded once. 1,000, he called, tone flat, as if this were simply part of the schedule. But everyone could hear the interest under the words. The 1,000-meter plate wavered in heat. Elise knew the range in numbers, but she also knew it in memories of long Appalachian hollows, in how far sound took to come back as echo, in the tiny delay between trigger break and steel ring. She checked elevation, then ignored it for a moment and studied the ground. Dust devils spun lazily near the halfway mark. The Mirage near the target bent in a tight right-to-left push, sharper than before. She pictured the bullet's arc, imagined it passing through stacked layers of air, each with its own intention. Her corrections were not perfect math. They were instinct sharpened by years of watching rounds land where they should not, and then adjusting until they did. Long breath. Trigger break. The rifle kicked, not violently, but with authority, and she rode the recoil without tension. Her shoulder barely shifted. Through the scope she saw the impact before she heard the sound. Dust erupted just off the plate's edge, then the steel jerked, paint flaring and flaking. The delayed, deep ring rolled back down the range like a slow bell. No one said a word. Rourke's jaw closed. His eyes flicked to the kestrel hanging from Tex's hand, then back to the girl on the mat. Tex watched the plates, not her, but his lips parted in something like grudging respect. She saw the drift, he muttered half to himself. He knew it. Anyone who had spent years behind glass knew it. That shot had not been luck. It had been a quiet argument with the air, and she had won. Elise cycled the bolt again, more out of habit than necessity. She did not call her own hit. She did not look back to see if anyone was watching. She logged the conditions in her mind and let the rifle settle. Locke's tone when he finally spoke was different from the flat indifference she had heard before. "Harper," he called out, voice carrying down the lane. That was solid work, not praise exactly, but no longer dismissal. She answered with a simple, "Yes, Senior Chief," then went back to saving the weapon, clearing it without flourish. Her movements were methodical, almost plain. It was everyone else who changed. Men who had joked about attachment now stood a little quieter. A couple of them stepped aside to let her pass when she carried the rifle back from the line. They did not meet her eyes, but their silence held something that had not been there before. Not friendship, not yet. But something just past doubt. Tex approached her near the weapon rack, towel still draped across his shoulders. He paused as if searching for the right balance between pride and annoyance. "Mirage at the target was ugly," he said. "You read it right." Elise simply nodded. It was lifting off the far berm, pushing the last 50 meters harder than it looked. Tex held her gaze for a moment, then huffed out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh. "Yeah." It was. He walked away before the conversation could turn into anything more. She did not chase it. Later that afternoon, they gathered in the briefing room, fluorescent lights humming above a scuffed table. A satellite image of a narrow valley glowed on the screen, jagged ridges casting long shadows across dry riverbeds and clustered compounds. The Joint Operations Center had sent down a tasking, possible insurgent movement through the corridor, signs of weapons trafficking, unknown number of fighters. "Team Raven will sit on this high ground here," Locke said, tapping the ridge line. "Overwatch the movement zone. Identify, track, and, if necessary, engage. It is primarily an observation and interdiction mission. We are not clearing the valley. We are watching it." He assigned sectors with practiced ease, pointing at squad leaders, assigning call signs. Tex got primary sniper responsibility on the ridge's western face. Another operator would cover the eastern flank with a designated marksman rifle. The rest would rotate security, eyes, and radios. Then Locke's finger landed briefly on Elise's name, typed in the margin of the operations slide. "Corporal Harper is attached as reserve long gun support," he said. "She will log ranges, atmospherics, and provide backup shots if Tex or the primary glass calls for it." He finally looked at her, but his eyes carried the weight of hierarchy, not partnership. "You are not primary," he said, voice firm but not cruel. "You stay behind, follow our lead, do not improvise. Understood?" Elise nodded once. "Understood, Senior Chief." The words sat between them for a moment. Not primary. Reserve option. Attachment. She did not argue. Did not ask for more responsibility. Did not remind anyone of the steel that had rung at 1,000 meters. She just opened her small journal, turned to a fresh page, and began mapping that valley in her own language. Lines of wind, pockets of air, places where bullets would fall faster, and places where they would seemingly hang. Around her, the room buzzed with low conversation as men prepared for a mission they believed they understood. She sat, quiet as ever, pencil scratching softly over paper, already wrestling with an enemy none of them could see yet. Would you have spoken or stayed quiet? The valley looked quiet from the air. Too quiet. The satellite feed showed stacked walls, dusty courtyards, goats wandering through patches of scrub, and flat rooftops that glowed pale against the brown earth. The image updated every 10 seconds, refreshed by overhead drone orbit, and each time it cycled, Elise found something that didn't match. She leaned closer, tracing with a fingertip across a patch of dark soil near the eastern wall of the settlement. It wasn't the shape that bothered her, it was the shade. Soil didn't turn darker unless it had been disturbed recently. The drone timestamp showed 40 minutes old, but the footprint spread pattern wasn't 40 minutes settled. Dust hadn't fully landed. Moisture hadn't evaporated. Someone had stepped there long after the image was taken. She pointed once, quietly. No one turned. She didn't insist, just sat back again and let the screen move on. Later that afternoon, they rehearsed their movement route one more time. The projected ridge that overlooked the valley was narrow and steep, perfect for overwatch, perfect for early detection, perfect for someone else to be waiting. Elise noticed something odd when the camera panned over a cluster of mud walls. Dust wasn't rising straight. She could see a faint curl just behind the edge of the wall, like heat had been displaced there recently. Not heat from sunlight. Heat from movement. Someone had been positioned there long enough to disturb the air behind the structure. She approached Tex and lifted a finger toward the display. That spot there. Wind's bending wrong behind it. Tex glanced once, shrugged, and said, Valley heat plays tricks. Barrage always bends behind hard corners. Then he walked off to double-check his rifle case. She didn't correct him. That night, they reached the settlement under moonlight, boots sinking into soft dust. Air was cold enough that breath came white and brief. Elise moved at the rear of the column, eyes tracking wind patterns off rooftops. Wind on a still night didn't bend like that, not unless something had moved recently and unsettled the air. They found a single building that wasn't locked. A mud-walled house with small carpet scraps on the ground and a kettle near the embers of a stove. Elise crouched near it, lowered her hand above the metal, then jerked back slightly as warmth touched her palm. Warm. Not lukewarm, warm. Someone had heated water minutes before they entered. Her eyes went to the doorway, to the distance of footprints in the dust. Fresh depressions hadn't collapsed yet. Someone had poured tea, sat down, listened, and then left because they heard movement outside. Elise pointed toward the kettle, toward the temperature of the metal. They were just here within 10 minutes, she whispered. Locke glanced, nodded vaguely, and said, Locals pass through. We're not clearing this village, just observing. He walked away. She inhaled once, gently, measuring leftover heat off that metal. The steam didn't rise visible anymore, but that didn't matter. Her fingers knew the truth. Minutes. Not hours. Not the day before. Minutes. They moved through the outer corridor, placing eyes toward the ridgeline. Tex scanned rooftops with his optic. Locke whispered positions. Rourke tracked radio signals. Elise stayed quiet, watching dust swirl at ankle height, not drifting, not scattering. When dust moved against wind direction, that meant displacement, not weather. A narrow irrigation canal ran through the center of the village, dry now except for faint mud seams under its base. Elise slowed when she reached the small retaining wall above it. She crouched, not fully kneeling, just low enough to catch the air shift. Wind was blowing the wrong direction. It wasn't coming across the canal, it was leaving it. A hollow space behind dirt only exhales air if someone has just passed through, releasing stored heat, pushing air outward. Even a closed door can trap heat long enough to push a subtle current when opened. Someone had gone through that tunnel only moments before the team reached it. She turned. Someone moved through here, she said gently. Just now. Locke barely paused. Tex looked down once, but not long enough to see what she saw. Rourke walked past her, boots scattering dust without noticing the direction it carried. Push forward, Locke ordered. We're burning night to get high ground. The air shifted again. warm air escaping a space that should have been colder than open ground. Elise didn't chase them with her observation. Didn't insist. She simply watched the dust trail and let her understanding settle into silence. They crossed the small corridor and climbed toward the ridge. The moon hung behind bare branches. Coyotes barked somewhere beyond the tree line. The valley below looked empty, impossibly still, like nothing could go wrong. Yet warmth faded too quickly for movement to have been distant. Somebody was close. Someone who walked just seconds before the team arrived. Still, nobody slowed. Nobody investigated. Nobody circled back. Elise glanced once more at the dark mouth of that irrigation line. The wind shouldn't have moved outward. Not at that angle. Not with that rhythm. She followed anyway. Sometimes silence is obedience. Sometimes it is survival. Sometimes it is both. They took position along the ridgeline, rifles resting against loose stone. Tex took western flank. Locke monitored center sector. Elise sat third line, no spotlight, no authority, just her notebook and the mountain wind. Below, the dark valley breathed. Somewhere down there, air still moved in ways that didn't belong to the night. Have you ever seen something right in front of you, and everyone else walked past it? The first rounds came in low, like someone flicking pebbles against stone. Elise heard the change in sound before anyone shouted. The valley had been quiet for nearly an hour, just the soft hum of radios and the faint rustle of gear when someone shifted their weight. Then, a single round slapped into the rock above Tex's position with a sharp, angry crack. Another followed half a heartbeat later, then another, walking in. "Contact! High ridge, north face," Tex called, voice suddenly tight. The night lit up in streaks. Heavy machine gun fire poured down from the opposite slope, invisible at first, just arcs of fire tracked by glowing tracers that carved red lines over their heads. The world shifted from stillness to chaos in one long breath. "Get down! Get down!" Locke shouted, shoving one of the younger operators flat against the rocks. Elise dropped behind a half-collapsed stone lip, the rifle pressed under her body to shield the optic. She felt dust hit her neck as rounds chewed the edge of the ridge where she had been lying seconds before. The rock spat fragments like teeth. Below them, the wadi line that they had planned to use as a fallback suddenly exploded with strikes. The enemy had the lower creek bed dialed in. Elevated gun nests stitched the ground in intersecting arcs, cutting off any easy retreat down the slope. Whoever had planned this knew the terrain. Knew where men would run. "Gun nests at 1 o'clock, someone yelled. Multiple, elevated positions. Elise lifted her head a fraction, just enough to bring the scope near the edge. Her heart pounded so hard it felt like it might bounce the rifle, but years of slow breathing on cold hills had built a reflex that overrode panic. She took a shallow breath, held it low, and eased the scope over the rock. She caught flickers first. Short flashes along the opposite ridge as muzzle blasts punched out of narrow slits cut into the rock face. The guns were dug in high, almost directly across from them, with clear views down into the wadi. Perfect fields of fire. Terrible news for anyone caught in that channel. "Tex, pick up those guns," Locke shouted. Tex tried. He rolled to a better angle, shouldered his rifle, and peered through his optic. Another burst of machine gun fire raked along their line, kicking chips of stone into his cheek. One round hit the edge of his scope housing. The glass spider-webbed instantly. He swore once, sharp, and ducked down, covering his face. "My glass is done," he growled. "I have shapes, not targets." Another volley slammed into the rocks around Locke. One round caught him across the vest plates with a terrible hollow thud that sounded like a bat swinging into metal. The force lifted him off his feet and drove the air out of his lungs. He hit the ground hard, coughing, trying to suck in breath that refused to come. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then they all moved at once. "Smoke, now!" someone called. "Shift left, find cover." Operators scrambled along the ridge, staying low as they searched for a better angle, a blind spot, anything. Rounds chased their movement, sparking against stone, whining off into the dark. The ridge that had seemed safe minutes before now felt like the inside of a funnel. Elise squeezed herself tighter behind her fragment of rock. She could see nothing from here except flashes and dust. Staying put meant waiting for the enemy to walk fire straight onto her position. Staying put meant hoping someone else solved the problem. She pushed herself backward instead, sliding on her stomach down a slight crease in the slope until her boots hit a narrow goat track. A stray animal pen, nothing more than a broken stone wall and a sagging wooden fence, jutted out below. It was not perfect cover, but it was something different. A new angle. She crawled the last few feet, dragging the rifle beside her, every muscle braced for the impact of a round that might come at any second. None did. The enemy guns were focused on the ridgeline where the team had first fired from. They thought that was where the threat lived. The goat shed smelled of old straw and dust. Slats of wood leaned at odd angles, leaving thin gaps that looked out toward the opposite face. Elise slid the barrel through one of those gaps, pushing aside a dangling rope. Her cheek found the stock again, familiar weight settling under bone. The ridge across from her looked different from here. She was lower, almost level with the gun nests now, instead of above them. The machine gun bursts came from a rock cut that formed a dark square in the stone, like a missing tooth. Every time the gun fired, a brief tongue of flame licked out, giving away just enough. Wind curled up the cliff face in ways that would have confused most shooters. It came from the valley floor, then bent sideways, pressed tight against stone. It would push bullets right when they left the muzzle, then yank them left near the target. If she trusted only what she felt at her position, she would miss. The air carried dust from earlier impacts. She watched the last plume drift, saw it pulled sideways before it settled. Another small burst from the enemy gun kicked powder out of the rock face, showing the path of invisible air. Angle fire, she reminded herself. Steep shots never behaved like range, flat ones. She did the math without numbers, the way she had done as a kid on ridges back home. She pictured the bullet dropping not straight down, but down across that curling wind. She adjusted a hair low, a hair into the push, trusting instincts that had been sharpened long before someone put her in uniform. "Harper, status?" Locke's voice rasped over the radio. He had found enough breath to speak, but each word sounded like it hurt. "Harper, in cover," she answered, voice steady even though her pulse thundered. "Eyes on primary gun nest. Do not expose," Locke ordered. "We will reposition and—" His sentence cut off as another burst chewed into the rock near him. Elise let his voice fall away. It was not disrespect. It was survival. There would not be time for a three-step plan. She exhaled until her chest felt nearly empty, then eased the last of her breath out over the trigger. The sight picture settled, then drifted, then settled again, as she rode the rhythm of the recoil trail in her mind before it even happened. The shot broke and the rifle shoved back into her shoulder. The muzzle flash lit the inside of the goat shed for a slice of a second. Through the scope, she saw the heavy gun jerk, then stop. A figure behind it flinched backward, head snapping to the side, then disappearing from view. The gun's voice died mid-burst. For a second, the valley went strangely quiet. You could still hear shouting, still hear smaller rifles snapping from other positions, but that one dominating roar vanished. Every man on the ridge heard it. The absence felt almost as loud as the machine gun itself. Static crackled in her earpiece, then Tex's voice slipped through, softer than before. "That was not luck," he said. No one argued. There was no time to enjoy the silence. She knew the pattern. Where there was one gun, there was a spotter nearby. Someone had been helping that gunner walk fire onto their positions. Someone deeper in the rock, lower, harder to see. Elise shifted her scope a few inches higher, scanning the area around the black mouth of the firing slit. The opening itself was just shadow now, no flame, no obvious movement. But above and to the left, a smaller crack in the rock glowed faintly warmer against the cooler stone around it. A head. Barely. The outline of a man pressed back against the interior wall, probably thinking himself invisible, eyes locked on the ridge where the seals had been pinned. She could not see his weapon, could not see his hands. But every instinct screamed that he was the one who had been calling corrections, pointing out targets, lining up their deaths. She adjusted elevation a fraction, compensating for that slightly different angle. The wind near that crack bent more sharply, tugged down by the lip of the rock. Her brain mapped the shift and made the quiet adjustments no kestrel could advise on. Another breath, another stillness, another shot. The rifle barked. The ledge around the crack spat dust and chips. The faint, warm outline folded sideways and disappeared. No scream reached her, just a sudden absence of movement. "Second target down," she reported. "Possible spotter." On the ridge above, the gunfire slackened. Without someone pushing corrections, the remaining shooters went wide, their rounds digging into dirt and empty stone. Locke, still on his back, managed to pull himself up on one elbow. Wind wheezed in his chest, but his eyes were clear when he looked toward the goat shed that now held his smallest, least trusted team member. He keyed his radio, voice lower now. "Harper," he said. "Stay in position. Hold cover. You are our shield." It was not loud. It was not a speech. But every man on the net heard it. She answered the same way she always did. "Copy. Holding cover." The difference was not in her tone. It was in theirs. Movement on the ridge changed. Instead of scattering, the operators settled into positions that took advantage of her new angle. They shifted behind rocks that gave them lines of fire when she suppressed. They moved because she spoke, timing their dashes between her shots. Tex crouched behind a boulder, looking down toward her makeshift nest, the cracked optic forgotten for the moment. He would never say it out loud, not in that instant, but his posture told the truth. His rifle was no longer the center of this fight. Every time someone needed to move, someone said, "Wait for Harper." Every time someone had to cross an exposed patch of rock, they asked, "You got me," and waited for her calm, "On you," before sprinting. In the space of a few gunshots, something fundamental had shifted. She was no longer the add-on at the back of the file, no longer the quiet afterthought in the briefing room. From behind a broken goat shed wall, 18-year-old Corporal Elise Harper had become the one thing between SEAL Team Raven and the valley swallowing them whole. They regrouped behind a rock shelf that dipped just far enough away from the ridgeline to catch a pocket of safety. Dust still drifted in thin streams where debris had rolled off the slope. Rourke worked a radio call to higher command, voice low, clipped. Tex scraped a fragment of glass from his cracked optic. Locke leaned against the stone, shoulders heavy, breath shallow, trying not to let anyone notice the way one arm rested tighter across his ribs. Elise set her rifle down and opened her small journal, scanning the page of wind notes she'd marked earlier. She wasn't writing now, just cross-referencing everything she had seen during the engagement. Her handwriting was impossibly neat, small loops and diagonal notations, symbols that didn't resemble conventional range markings. Locke pushed himself up and moved closer, eyes narrowing, not at her, but at the page. The shapes drawn there weren't standard dope logs. They weren't distance charts or velocity formulas. They were topographic wind codes, mapped in curves, ridge heat pockets, upward mirage breaks, counter-drift pockets near valley spines, and in the margin, she had drawn something no one wrote anymore, WC14L45T1HM. Locke recognized it before he could stop himself. Mountain curvature identifiers. Something only senior long-range cadre taught. Something predating common electronic calculators, passed down in small circles, mostly now abandoned because younger shooters relied on digital elevation tools. His voice came out quiet, almost involuntary. "Where did you learn that?" Elise looked up, surprised, not defensive, not proud. "My grandfather," she said. "He trained mountain rescue. He had a way of reading wind off terrain lines." Locke didn't respond. He just stood still. They moved again after radio confirmation, transitioning down to the staging point near a narrow, dry wash. The whole team spaced out, some refilling water, some laying out gear to reset optics, others just taking the breath the fight had stolen from them. A transport Humvee rolled in, dust whipping behind its wheels. A man stepped out wearing clean sleeves, a joint observer patch at his shoulder. Captain Elliot Marsh. He took 3 steps toward Locke, offering a handshake, then turned to Tex, checking on his cracked sight. Then he saw Elise's open journal on the ground beside the pack she was reorganizing. He froze. Not dramatically, just stopped moving. It was the way someone reacts to a memory, not a surprise. He crouched, not touching the book, only looking. "Who wrote that?" Marsh asked. Elise reached to pull it back, not thinking much of it. "I did, sir." "Who taught it to you?" She hesitated, not because she was unsure, but because no one had ever asked her directly. "My grandfather," she said softly. "He worked deep-range rescue teams in the mountains. He said wind sits differently on cold ridges than warm ones." Marsh exhaled, long and slow. "That notation," he whispered almost to himself, "was used before we standardized ballistic wind tables, before GPS, before apps." Locke exchanged a glance with Rourke, though neither spoke. "That system," Marsh continued, "was taught only to cadre who worked steep-angle rescues, men who shot in cold wind at altitude when equipment failed." He stood up straighter. "And most of them are gone. No one moved, no one joked. No one corrected anything." The air settled into a strange silence, not heavy, not embarrassed, just reverent. Marsh nodded once, firmly, not at her rifle, not at her performance, but at the fact that a fading tradition had survived through a girl who said nothing about it. "Carry on," he said, then walked away. No applause, no ceremony. Just that moment. Respect settling without a word. They reached the secondary ridge just before extraction, the sky losing its color, air cooling fast enough that breath fogged between sentences. The terrain stretched wide ahead of them, broken shale, angled slopes, and distant steel plates anchored against a low berm. They were not supposed to fire again. They were waiting for transport. But Command wanted proof of Overwatch capability before final clearance. A short demonstration. Nothing dramatic. Tex stepped up first, though his optic was newly replaced. He tried to adjust his cheek weld, then settled behind his rifle. Wind crawled across the ground, swirling from left at knee height, then drifting right near the lip of the valley. Mirage feathered sideways in layers, not uniform, not readable through a single indicator. Tex fired anyway. Steele stayed silent. He cycled the bolt, fired again. Miss. The air betrayed him twice, first drifting the shot too far into valley pole, then kicking the second round slightly high. He sat back on his elbows and shook his head without excuse. Nobody laughed now. Nobody wanted to. "Conditions are dirty," Locke said, not unkind, but matter of fact. Elise waited behind the group, not stepping forward. She had already done more than anyone expected. Silence was safer than volunteering. Rourke glanced back. "Harper," he said, the tone neither mocking nor dismissive, "take a rep." She simply nodded. She moved to the firing mat, not rushed, not hesitant, just deliberate. The rifle sat naturally when she rested it into her shoulder. The ridge ahead shimmered with layered heat still rising off stone. A plume of dust from Tex's last round settled along the rocks 200 meters behind the target. She watched it. Not the target watched how it curved before settling. Wind wasn't steady. It was angling up the slope, catching higher air pressure, and pulling rounds left, not right. Most shooters would miss that. She marked 3/10 into the push, then lifted elevation. "Hold, right .3, she murmured, almost to herself. Elevation 6.1 up? Nobody corrected her. Nobody questioned. She let her breathing fall flat. 3 small breaths, a still moment between them, then one slow exhale that settled into the trigger. The rifle cracked. The echo rolled down the mountain like distant thunder. A half-second later, the steel plate jolted. Then the sound returned low, heavy, final, the unmistakable ring that no one imagines. Silence followed. Not the silence of disbelief, the silence of acknowledgement. Tex lowered his head. Not shame, not frustration, just acceptance. Someone behind him breathed out through their teeth, as though that single sound carried everything they had not said in the weeks leading to this moment. The wind shifted again, but it no longer felt like resistance. Locke stepped forward, slow, carrying the stiffness of bruised ribs. He stood a moment behind her, letting the truth sit where it needed to. He didn't look at the rifle. He didn't look at the steel downrange. He looked at her. "You're Raven 1 now," he said. "No ceremony. No speech. You will carry the long gun slot." There was a shift among the men, not dramatic, not spoken, but visible. Shoulders dropped, arms uncrossed. Eyes turned toward her without skepticism. It wasn't admiration. It was recognition earned, confirmed, unchallenged. Tex gave a faint nod. A real nod. No sarcasm. Rourke adjusted his posture, not stiff, not dismissive. One of the youngest operators, who had barely said a word since deployment, shifted his rifle strap and repositioned himself behind her as though the arrangement of places had changed. Because it had. Someone finally said what none of them had been able to say earlier. That wasn't luck. Elise didn't answer. She closed the bolt, safed the weapon, cleared the chamber, and folded the bipod with practiced hands. Her movements held no pride, no expectation that anything should now change because of a single shot. She had been shooting long distances, long before uniforms, long before rank. Respect simply caught up. Locke exhaled once, slow, then walked past her toward the extraction point. The others followed, not in front of her. Beside her, exactly where equals stand. Sometimes respect is not spoken. Sometimes it doesn't arrive in applause, challenge coins, or cheers. Sometimes it arrives in the placement of feet, the quiet nods, the way men reposition around someone without being told to. Sometimes respect is not handed. It is earned when the range goes quiet. Back at base, the lights over the maintenance bay flickered dim and yellow. The world outside still carried the night's cold, but inside the air smelled of oil, sand-filled cases, and solvent. Gear lay in piles waiting to be logged, inspected, and stowed. Voices were low, not tired, just quieter than they had been days before. Elise sat at a metal bench with her rifle broken down across a cloth, swabbing carbon from the barrel. She recorded new atmospheric adjustments into her journal, updating elevation drift from the ridge, marking how wind rolled differently against stone at dusk. Her handwriting stayed small, steady, like the calm of someone who wasn't trying to impress anyone. Tex walked up without speaking. He set 2 boxes of precision ammo next to her kit. Not tossed, not slid-placed. "I won't need these as much," he said quietly. "You keep them." Then he walked away. He didn't wait for thanks. She didn't offer any. Respect didn't need ceremony. Locke tightened the straps on his vest, wincing once where the round had bruised him through the plates. He paused near her bench on his way out. He looked different, not softer, not apologetic, but changed in the small ways that matter. "No one carried us today," he said. "You did." He didn't stand there long enough for her to answer. He just nodded once, not toward her rank, not toward her rifle, but toward her presence. Then he walked out the bay door into the fading light. Elise didn't smile. Didn't react. She simply closed her journal, finished wiping the scope housing, and locked the rifle into its case. Her work had not changed because their opinions had. The process mattered more than the recognition. She stood, lifted her pack, and walked toward the exit with the same quiet posture she had arrived with. No celebration. No spotlight. Just duty. Narrator reflection. In the military, the quiet ones often carry more than weight. They memorize the wind when others memorize noise. They take responsibility before anyone offers it. They step forward without expecting applause. Sometimes heroes don't walk ahead of others. They walk beside them, unseen, until the moment they're needed. Real honor is when no one doubts you, but you still carry the responsibility without pride. You've been listening to a true moment of quiet courage, when an 18-year-old, overlooked and dismissed, became the only person her entire team trusted when silence mattered most. A shot no one believed she could make changed everything, not through pride or noise, but through steady hands and a calm heart when others hesitated. Stories like these remind us that strength is not always loud. Sometimes it arrives without announcement, without recognition, and without anyone asking for it. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to Military and Veteran Stories so these lessons never fade away.